Good afternoon, and welcome to the American Society of Clinical Oncology COVID-19 and Cancer Presscast. Before I turn it over to our program, this is a reminder that we will have Q&A at the end of the presentation. To submit a question, please use the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. Please type your questions into the text field and hit send, and please keep the drop-down as all panelists. Additionally, please remember to direct your question to one of our panelists. I'd now like to turn this over to your first speaker for today, Dr. Burris.
Thank you very much, and welcome. My name is Skip Burris. I'm the president of the American Society of Clinical Oncology and the chief medical officer at the Sarah Cannon Research Institute in Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for joining this Presscast, which is being co-hosted by the American Society of Clinical Oncology and its affiliate organization, the Association for Clinical Oncology. The COVID-19 pandemic is affecting nearly every facet of life. For people with cancer, the impact is especially severe, whether or not they've been exposed to the virus. We're here today to talk about that impact and to offer a path forward for cancer care and the broader healthcare system. Next slide. I'm joined by several colleagues from ASCO, from the front lines of cancer care, and from the administration. Dr. Anand Shah is Deputy Commissioner for Medical and the FDA's efforts to keep the cancer drug approval process moving and to help alleviate shortages in critical medicines. Dr. Melissa Dillman is a hematologist and oncologist at the Harbin Clinic, a large multi-specialty physician-owned practice in Rome, Georgia. She also serves as chair of the association's Government Relations Committee. She'll share a firsthand account of what oncology practices are facing as they serve their patients during this crisis. Dr. Richard Selsky is ASCO's Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President. He'll discuss what the federal government has done to support the cancer care system and share how the oncology community has come together to innovate and adapt to difficult circumstances. Dr. Jonathan Marin is a bioethicist at Boston Children's Hospital, a pediatric oncologist at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and is on the Center for Bioethics teaching faculty at Harvard Medical School. He is also chair-elect of the ASCO Ethics Committee and has led the development of new ASCO guidance on the allocation of scarce medical resources. Dr. Gary Lyman leads healthcare policy and quality activities at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, Washington. He'll talk about the key lessons of Washington State's early mobilization to address the pandemic and to sustain essential cancer care services. And finally, I'll discuss the path toward a post-crisis future before opening the call to your questions. Next slide. Start off, I'd like to make two main points. First, people with cancer are being hit hard, especially hard by the COVID-19 infection. Secondly, the pandemic is placing incredible demands on the cancer care system, with sometimes tragic results for patients and their families. Next slide. We've known since January that the toll of COVID-19 would be heaviest on people who are older who have underlying health conditions. And clearly, individuals with cancer are at especially high risk. They are typically older adults, often with other underlying conditions, and their immune systems may be suppressed due to chemotherapy, radiation therapy, or other treatments. The limited data available thus far are sobering. In Italy, about 20% of COVID-related deaths occurred in people with cancer. And in China, COVID-19 patients who had cancer were about 5 times more likely than others to die or to be placed on a ventilator in the intensive care unit. U.S. data collection is less mature, but as Dr. Shulsky will describe, ASCO and other organizations are aggressively collecting and analyzing relevant data. We also have a little evidence to help guide us on the treatment of COVID-19 patients with cancer. Physicians have to rely on limited data, anecdotal reports, and their own professional expertise. On that basis, many are delaying or modifying treatment plans to reduce the patient's risk of infection. Next slide. Even when patients are directly exposed to COVID-19, we face daunting challenges to optimum patient care. One of the biggest challenges is around delays in care. Delays may be necessary to protect patients from COVID-19 exposure, and in some cases, there are evidence-based workarounds. For example, chemotherapy can sometimes be used to keep tumors at bay while certain cancer surgeries are postponed. But often that's not true. We're concerned that some hospitals have effectively deemed all cancer surgeries to be elective, requiring them to be postponed. For patients with fast-moving or hard-to-treat cancers, this delay could be devastating. Delays in screening and diagnosis are also a major concern. In a typical month, roughly 150,000 Americans are diagnosed with cancer. But right now, routine screening visits are postponed, and patients with pain or other warning signs may put off a doctor's visit because of social distancing. Secondly, we're facing significant supply shortages. In oncology, the most urgent shortages are with medicines for sedation and pain management. These drugs are needed to intubate patients and place them on respirators. Many were already in short supply before the pandemic, and they're in extremely high demand today. Some of the same drugs are essential to cancer care. For example, many cancer patients rely on opioid medications to manage severe pain. ASCO has been in routine contact with the FDA and the DEA, and we know FDA is working around the clock with manufacturers to increase production. Third, our inability to see our patients in person is a huge and challenging shift. Human touch and attention is a vital part of oncology care. Yet almost overnight, we've had to shift to telehealth. While this shift may reduce a patient's risk of contracting COVID-19, it can also be hard on patients and hard on the care teams. And fourth, clinical trials are slowing dramatically at many institutions. Today, we're announcing the results of a new ASCO survey of clinical trial programs, which we're posting online ahead of publication in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, Oncology Practice. Only a few weeks into the pandemic, 60% of research programs reported a halted screening or enrollment for at least some of their trials. They reported a range of key challenges, in particular, a decline in patients' ability or willingness to come in for required evaluations. Trial interruptions are devastating news for thousands of patients. In many cases, clinical trials are the best or only appropriate option for care, including promising experimental therapy. At my own institution, Sarah Cannon, here in Nashville, Tennessee, with sites also in Florida, Denver, and Kansas City, we have tried to stay safe while staying the course, but yet we have still seen approximately 1/3 of our clinical trial portfolio put on hold by pharma biotech as a result of COVID-19. Next slide. It is also clear that COVID-19 will continue to affect cancer care delivery for months or years to come. For example, backlogs in cancer care will be unavoidable. The cancer care workforce will be overburdened. Many health workers have been infected with COVID-19. Some may be laid off or furloughed. And those who remain will have had months of challenges for which they weren't trained. For oncology practices, the financial impact will be substantial. Most physician-owned practices are effectively small businesses and don't have the resources to sustain themselves through months of reduced patient flow. In some underserved parts of the country, the closure of oncology practices or small hospitals could eliminate patients' access for care. In a few moments, Dr. Dillman will talk more about the practical realities on the ground. But first, it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce to you Dr. Anand Shah.
The opportunity to provide an update on the critical role that FDA is playing to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to briefly highlight a few areas of work going on right now at the FDA with regard to treatments and therapeutic and vaccine development for COVID-19, and lastly, comment on our approach to clinical trials and the needs of patients during the pandemic. As all of you know, at this time, there are no FDA-approved drug products to treat COVID-19. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been working to facilitate development and availability of therapeutics for use by patients, physicians, health systems as expeditiously and safely as possible. On March 31st, we stood up a new program to expedite the development of potentially safe and effective life-saving treatments. This program, known as the Coronavirus Treatment Accelerator Program, or CTAP, is using every tool at the agency's disposal to bring new therapies to sick patients as quickly as possible, while at the same time supporting research to further evaluate whether these medical countermeasures are safe and effective for treating patients infected with this novel virus. We're maintaining our regulatory flexibility, or maximizing our regulatory flexibility, I should say, and providing ultra-rapid advice and review. We've streamlined our internal processes and operations for developers and scientists to send in inquiries and requests, and we're providing resources to healthcare providers and researchers to help them submit emergency requests to use investigational products. For example, we've reviewed study protocols within 24 hours in many cases. We've also reviewed single patient expanded access requests generally within a handful of hours. I should say there are a variety of therapeutic areas that we're evaluating, including antiviral drugs like remdesivir that might treat a specific virus, drugs that inhibit certain receptors and may be helpful in reducing lung inflammation and improving lung function in COVID-19 patients. We're also looking at convalescent plasma, hyperimmune globulin. As most folks on this call know, these are blood products that are taken from blood donated by people who recovered from the virus that could either shorten the length or lessen the severity of the illness. On April 17th, we issued guidance to provide recommendations on pathways available to providers for the use of investigational convalescent plasma. We spelled out patient eligibility, collection of plasma. We also specified donor eligibility and donor qualifications and requirements around labeling and record keeping. We're also working hard to evaluate whether existing therapies such as chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine, as we all know from the significant national media attention, can help treat patients with COVID-19. And really, our public health work requires striking the right balance between aggressively supporting innovation and ensuring that Americans can ultimately trust the drugs that they take. Our staff is continuing to work across all sectors to expedite the development of numerous innovative potential treatments and preventions. And just a few points about vaccines. At this time, there is no vaccine to prevent COVID-19. We're engaged with a host of vaccine developers globally to help expedite development and availability of a vaccine. On March 18th, the FDA and the EMA, or the European Medicines Agency, jointly chaired the first global regulators meeting to discuss regulatory strategies and also synergies to facilitate the development of a new vaccine. On March 30th, HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, took steps to speed the development and manufacturing of vaccines to prevent COVID-19. We worked with New Jersey-based Janssen Research and Development and also Moderna of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Just of note, the Janssen phase 1 clinical trial is set to begin no later than fall of 2020, with the goal of making a vaccine available for emergency use in early 2021. We're working with our federal partners, such as BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, looking to engage with companies to identify potential investment and development targets, for a vaccine. And we're really maximizing all the regulatory flexibility given to us by Congress and continuing to work with Congress on areas where there may be additional opportunities, for the agency to better streamline its operations. And lastly, around clinical trials, we certainly understand that COVID-19 is leading to significant challenges across existing and open clinical trials, and there are likely to be protocol deviations and modifications. We issued a guidance which has since been updated twice that puts patient safety at the forefront and signals a willingness of the FDA to accept alternative methods for monitoring and data collection while maintaining safety, compliance with good clinical practice, and really minimizing risk to trial integrity. I would say that the remarkable thing about the COVID-19 guidances are the speed at which we were able to draft and release them. We've been able to develop and formulate guidances within weeks rather than months or years. For all clinical trial conduct changes, really patient safety remains paramount and guides our recommendations, and hence the expediency on the part of the agency. While we can give general guidance in some areas, in many specific situations, it's dependent on multiple variables such as the patient population, the drug that's under study, and the type of clinical trial endpoint and other context-dependent issues. In these circumstances, we encourage sponsors to discuss their proposals with the FDA review division, and really what's important, to this group here is we encourage you to engage with CDER, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and also the Oncology Center of Excellence, Rick Pazder's group. We recommend that sponsors work closely with their local IRBs and ethics committees to determine whether new trials should be initiated and ongoing trials be continued. And really a major concern here is exposing patients to healthcare facilities and ultimately risk of exposure to COVID-19. And so our guidance highlights, a willingness to explore alternative locations to standard clinical trial visits, including remote clinical safety follow-up visits by phone, virtual visit telemedicine, obtaining study labs and imaging at more local facilities, and really shipping investigational drugs, including oncology drugs, to patient home or pharmacy or to their home pharmacy. And oftentimes, COVID-19 has necessitated that we decentralize certain aspects of trials, which has been a concept of interest for many years. And we're certain that to learn from this experience, and we hope it will inform future efforts to make trials even more patient-friendly. And that's my update from FDA today. Again, I want to thank ASCO for making the opportunity for FDA to come to the table. We're always happy to engage, with both the organization and with ASCO members, investigators, and the broader oncology community. Our door is always open to you. Thanks, Dr. Burris.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaw. That was very helpful. It was an honor having you join us, and I understand that you might need to jump off the call a bit early, but we appreciate hearing your insights, and have a great day. Dr. Dillman will now share a view from the front lines. Dr. Dillman?
Thank you, Dr. Shaw and Dr. Burris. My name is Dr. Melissa Dillman. I practice medical large multi-specialty clinic in Northwest Georgia in a community that had one of the earliest community outbreaks in the Southeast in the first week of March, which was linked to 2 large church services. In the first week of the outbreak, our community decided to shelter in place earlier than our state mandate. This effort was led by our newly appointed Director of Public Health, who had just retired the month before as our Chair of Pulmonary Medicine for our clinic. My patient population is a mix of suburban and rural patients who are older with limited access to health care and high rates of comorbidities, including diabetes, obesity, lung disease, and cancer. Next slide. Our clinic has been significantly impacted by COVID-19, but in the Cancer Center, we have taken proactive measures and adapted services quickly so that we are still able to deliver essential cancer care. Some of the major adaptations we have either chosen to make or in some cases been forced to make to protect our patients and our workforce have included screening all of our patients and caregivers at the door with a series of questions and temperature checks. We are only allowing one person to come in with a patient, which has been challenging for our patients who oftentimes have extended families involved in their care team. As oncologists, we have chosen not to go to our local hospitals unless there's an emergency so that we don't bring COVID back to our already immunocompromised patients. We are instead using electronic charts and residents or hospitalists who are already based at those hospitals to do virtual consults. We have also moved our tumor boards, which are usually attended by 25 or more members every week of our healthcare team, to a virtual format, which has been successful. We have had to prioritize our most urgent treatments and surgeries. Our surgical colleagues have had to focus on surgeries that are time essential. Just yesterday, I spoke with a young woman who was completing chemotherapy for a locally advanced HER2 positive breast cancer. After examining her breast to see how she had responded, I spoke with her breast surgeon over the phone and encouraged him to move forward with surgery to see if her tumor had completely resolved because I couldn't feel anything anymore in her breast. As this would make dramatic differences in her treatment options, he agreed to do so, and she is scheduled to be operated on next week. We have encouraged those patients to continue on treatment, especially if treatment is being given with a curative intent, or if the cancer is responding well already to treatment. Some patients have, however, chosen to interrupt certain treatments or skip a treatment. My own father is on maintenance therapy for lymphoma in my office, and we have discussed holding his maintenance therapy this month to make sure that he is protected. Our breast cancer centers and endoscopy center and lung screening programs have seen a dramatic decline in screening tests as patients have been sheltering in place. I live in a community with a high incidence of lung cancer, and we have great concerns about patients missing their screening lung scans, as this program has already proven to be finding earlier lung cancers that are curable over the last 5 years since we started this program. We are worried about mammograms and colonoscopies being missed or skipped this year and how this may impact the stage of cancers when they present. We are also worried about the ability of our screening centers, as Dr. Burris mentioned, to catch up with the backlog of cases when patients begin to come back into our centers. During this pandemic, we have been able to rapidly adapt and employ telehealth for the first time in our community. But we have faced many obstacles with the lack of built-in cameras in some of our own physicians' offices, the lack of access to laptops or smartphones for our patients, especially out in the rural communities, and limited education about how to use these programs, and limitations in their access to Wi-Fi. We have had to employ one person in my office who calls each patient prior to their virtual visit to make sure they understand how to access the program. One of the innovations we have been able to roll out is using our home health agencies to send nurses into the home and use iPads to connect us with our elderly patients who are sheltering in place. Next slide. The human toll on patients and their families is considerable, and we will continue to feel this for a long time. This is something hard to measure, but I witness it daily. One of my patients with pancreatic cancer shared with me just the other day that the hardest part of her whole treatment wasn't losing her hair or nausea or physical pain, but the emotional pain of not being able to be with her grandchildren or hug her children when she knows she may not have that much time left. Earlier, I shared with you that our clinic has limited caregivers who can come in with patients, but our hospitals have not allowed any caregivers to go in with them when family members are ill. Just 2 weeks ago, I had one of my lung cancer patients come into my office to go over his scan results. He has stage 4 lung cancer, but he's on immunotherapy, and his scan showed that all of his disease was gone. I thought he would be so excited by this news, but there wasn't even a smile on his face. He was alone, and he said he wasn't excited. He couldn't be excited because his wife was in the intensive care unit. She had just been diagnosed with a large tumor in her stomach, and he hadn't been there to hold her hand when she got her bad news. These stories are a few of the many that weigh heavy on me and my team every day. On a separate note, we are also concerned looking forward to the future as to how our clinic and our other clinics in the community can provide care if the financial toll of this COVID crisis causes physician groups or hospitals to close, or training programs to be put on hold, especially in rural areas where we are already facing workforce shortages. We are concerned about the ability of healthcare in America to be able to face future crises like we are facing today. With that said, I will turn it over to Dr. Richard Shilsky.
Thanks so much, Dr. Dillman. Well, while the circumstances remain difficult, as you've heard, I think it's fair to say that much-needed relief is coming from the federal government, and collectively, the cancer community is rising to the challenge. Next slide. We've been encouraged by the federal government's flexibility and creativity so far. The table you see here goes into some detail, but to cite just a few examples, CMS moved quickly to loosen Medicare's restrictions on telehealth. We're hearing anecdotally that patients and providers have welcomed it as a way to protect themselves from COVID-19 exposure while still staying connected. The National Cancer Institute and FDA have taken steps to sustain clinical trials by offering new flexibility, for example, allowing certain experimental treatments to be shipped directly to patients' homes, as Dr. Shah emphasized. The FDA's efforts to address shortages of critical care medicines are hugely welcome. We're still monitoring this closely, but are hopeful that we can minimize the impact on patients with cancer. And Congress has taken encouraging initial steps to help cancer care providers weather these difficult times, though clearly more will be needed. Next slide. We've also seen the cancer care community come together in an unprecedented way to address the pandemic. Here at ASCO, we created a COVID-19 resource center for oncology care providers in early March, and we've been updating it frequently. By going to asco.org, members can quickly find what they need and get back to focusing on their patients. For example, we provide a compendium of evidence-based information and expert recommendations on dealing with many of the clinical challenges you've heard about today. Together with our colleagues at other cancer care organizations, we've also put together a set of resources that cut across job categories and specialties. With the Oncology Nursing Society, we're holding a series of webinars on optimizing care delivery and protecting the workforce during the pandemic. We're collaborating with the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship to answer the most common questions from patients, posting the answers on cancer.net. With the Infectious Diseases Society of America, we collaborated on a podcast featuring one of our guests today, Dr. Gary Lyman. We're also working with oncology practices to obtain data on how the virus is affecting their patients, their cancer treatment, and their outcome. Last week, ASCO launched a new registry to collect longitudinal data during the COVID-19 pandemic and into 2021. The registry is open to all oncology practices nationwide and will be securely housed on ASCO's CancerLink Big Data platform. By looking at longitudinal data, we'll be able to learn about the longer-term effects of COVID-19 and its impact on cancer care, and understand what care approaches are working best. This is just one of several data collection efforts that aim to help us understand as quickly as possible the impact of the pandemic on our patients. For example, Dr. Lyman, who's with us today, is among the experts leading an effort to rapidly collect and disseminate data on cancer patients with COVID-19. Their project, known as the COVID-19 and Cancer Consortium, involves institutions across the country and is collecting data through a survey on its website, ccc19.org. And now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Marin, who led the development of another vital resource from ASCO.
Thank you, Dr. Shulsky. It's my honor to summarize ASCO's guidelines regarding the allocation of scarce healthcare resources during the COVID-19 pandemic. For reference, these guidelines are currently available on the ASCO website and will be published ahead of print on the Journal of in the Journal of Clinical Oncology on April 28th. One of the most difficult challenges caused by COVID-19 is the prospect of our medical needs outpacing our medical resources. Our hospitals, clinics, and clinicians are being stretched more thinly than ever before in modern medical history. Given the surge that's already been seen in some areas and is expected soon in others, there's the distinct possibility that the demand for medical resources, particularly critical care resources like ventilators and beds in the intensive care unit, will be greater than our supply. As a result, clinicians and institutions will be forced to make incredibly difficult, if not absolutely impossible, decisions. As a result, our aim was to provide guidance in these nearly impossible circumstances. Specifically, we hope to ensure that medical resources are allocated through a thoughtful process with advanced planning. This planning, which is always important in medical practice, is even more important now, to ensure that bedside clinicians aren't forced to make decisions about who will get scarce resources while simultaneously trying to provide care for that same patient at the bedside. Also, as representatives on oncologists and of the larger oncology community, we aim to ensure that, if resource allocation is necessary, that the perspectives and voices of oncologists, patients with cancer, and the oncology community at large is included in these discussions and plans. Next slide, please. In short, ASCO's recommendations encourage development and implementation of fair and equitable policies at the institutional level, while simultaneously outlining the role of the oncologist that the oncologist can and should have. A core message here is that even when impossible decisions have to be made between multiple patients who might all stand to benefit from a scarce resource, a cancer diagnosis alone shouldn't keep a patient from having a fair chance to access potentially life-saving medical resources. That's not to say, though, that patients with cancer should receive special consideration, or that a cancer diagnosis, particularly one that is very likely to result in a patient's death in the very short term, shouldn't be considered in allocation decisions. Instead, accurate evidence-based information about a patient's cancer diagnosis and prognosis should be considered in these decisions, just as they would be for a patient with heart disease, a gastrointestinal problem, or any other medical comorbidity. We don't have time today to go through in detail all of our recommendations, but a few important points. First, oncologists are experts at providing the highest quality care to the patient in front of them. But the COVID-19 pandemic and resultant resource shortages require focusing on the larger population of patients and maximizing overall health benefits, which may or may not always align with what's best for the patient in front of them. Also, as I mentioned a moment ago, it's imperative that institutions develop fair, consistent, and transparent policies before allocation becomes necessary. Doing this is necessary but not sufficient to ensure that we can separate decisions about how to allocate scarce medical resources from decisions about individual patient care made at the bedside. Finally, ASCO hopes to ensure that oncologists are fully engaged in this process whenever possible. While they might not be able to make final decisions about the allocation of scarce resources, and as I mentioned, they shouldn't be the ones making such decisions for their own patients, they absolutely should provide information about their own patients to those tasked with making these decisions to be sure that these decisions are informed and include the best possible data about patients' disease, prognosis, and expected course. Oncologists also should, whenever they can, play a role in communicating allocation decisions to their patients, doing this with compassion and honesty, given the long-standing important connection of oncology clinicians with patients and families. This role might differ depending on institutions and care settings. Finally, just like under typical circumstances, oncologists should engage in discussions with patients and families about advanced care planning early and often in order to prepare as best as possible for these difficult decisions and maximally ensure that patients' goals and values are considered. Ultimately, we hope that these choices won't be necessary at all. This is a somewhat unusual guideline, and that we'll be incredibly happy if we never actually have to use it as oncology clinicians. Whether or not that proves to be the case, we hope to ensure that patients with cancer can be reassured that decisions about medical resource allocation will be well-informed, evidence-based, and carried out with compassion and respect. Just as was the case before the pandemic and will be again after the pandemic is over, this is all ultimately about respecting the inherent value of the lives of patients with cancer. On that note, I'll now hand the baton to Dr. Gary Lyman, who will describe the state of Washington's response to the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. I'm Gary Lyman. I'm at the University of Washington here in Seattle in the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. I think many of you know that Washington State and the Seattle area was the initial epicenter of COVID-19 infection and mortality in the United States. And this has been highlighted actually in a PBS special on Frontline released this week, which really summarizes very nicely the early experience here called The Tale of Two Washingtons. The first case that was diagnosed here was a gentleman, 35-year-old gentleman that traveled from China, from Wuhan, and presented with symptoms after arriving in the U.S. The doctors were suspicious here at a local hospital here in Kirkland, Washington. And on January 19th, test results came back from the CDC confirming that he was infected with the coronavirus. He received an experimental treatment, and fortunately, because of or in spite of that treatment, recovered and has done well. Nonetheless, at the same time, a flu study was being conducted here at the University of Washington that suggested a strange and rapidly increasing pattern of acute respiratory symptoms, particularly among elderly patients in a local nursing home at a long-term care facility, also here in Kirkland, Washington. Efforts to get testing done were somewhat stymied by problems with the testing from the CDC that were available. And although we had our own local ability to test for the virus, we had to wait for FDA approval to actually do that testing. And that was finally granted in mid to late February. And within 5 days of getting that approval, we had diagnosed here at the university, mostly at the nursing home, 32 elderly patients with COVID-19. And unfortunately, 41 residents of that nursing home have gone on to die of COVID-19. All this in addition to efforts within our statistical group here to do modeling of the apparent rise in this infection from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation at the university projected if we didn't do anything, that as many as 100,000 cases would ultimately occur in the state of Washington, and probably hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths. Thus, on the next slide, you can see we immediately put into action both locally and at the state level. And I can't praise enough the efforts of the governor here, Jay Inslee, the mayors, health officials in the health department, as well as at the university and the major health institutions here. Our response, which began in early March and progressed through the second and third week of March at the state level, was to restrict large gatherings, and progressively schools were closed, larger businesses closed, and by March 23rd, stay-at-home policy was implemented, and all non-essential businesses and services were closed. We believe, based on what has happened since that time, that this has considerably flattened the curve. Our biggest concern here was that we would exceed the capacity of the healthcare system to deal with this rapid expanding epidemic. And we believe that perhaps now with some 12,000 cases, but far less than what were projected, and 647 deaths, that we are probably past the peak. But again, I must emphasize that this was a community-wide collaboration, both within the health systems and at the state level. At the university and the Cancer Center, we, of course, embraced the modeling projections as realistic and needed to take action. As was mentioned, like many other facilities, we broadly instituted telehealth and telemedicine services for patients who didn't require in-person visits or treatments. We immediately put into place screening procedures at the health facilities, including the Cancer Center. So all patients were screened for symptoms or recent contacts as they came in, and subsequently we expanded testing to all patients coming into either the hospital or the major clinics. At the same time, we realized many cancer patients still need to be treated. Their cancer poses a life-threatening situation, in some cases even more so than the virus. And so where treatment is needed, and it often is, we've implemented fairly aggressive supportive care measures in collaboration with our professional organizations like ASCO and NCCN, and aggressively supporting these patients through their course of treatment. As indicated, though, we feel we have modified the impact on our community. While we probably have reached the capacity of the health system, we have not exceeded it. In fact, in the last couple of weeks, the governor has sent back to the national stockpile some 400 ventilators that we had received. And we're, of course, doing our best to track with broader testing the current epidemic in our state. So the next slide just, I think, emphasizes that there are still challenges ahead. We've, of course, again, implemented for patients that need to be seen and treated social distancing. Protective equipment is broadly used by the providers. Where treatment delays will not compromise the patient's health, we've implemented those, but where they need treatment, again, aggressive supportive care. And the real interruption of essential cancer care, I think, has been minimized by the prompt action here. There still are challenges, as summarized here, and I think lessons for other parts of the country who have either only begun or not yet face this pandemic. And that is basically, we took the position very early that any patient coming in could be infected. And we presumed that they were infected until we were convinced that they were not. At the same time, we realized getting this tamped down early and as far as possible was essential to preventing these second and third waves of infection that we've seen in other epidemics in other parts of the world. I'm particularly concerned about rural, remote areas of both our state and the country because of limited resources. Many counties in the country and even in this state do not have many ICU beds and may not even have ventilators. So if it impacts on some of these more rural areas, maybe coming later than we've seen in the metropolitan areas, we need to be sure that they're getting resourced to be able to manage a rapid spike in COVID-19 infections. At the same time, as Dr. Shilsky indicated, both ASCO and a group I'm working with in some 90 institutions around the country are trying to collect and share data as rapidly as possible about the impact of COVID-19 on cancer patients, and hopefully share that information with providers to enhance their care and ability to recognize the complications of this disease. And they'll lay the groundwork, very importantly, for the coming clinical trials for both antiviral treatments as well as vaccines that may prevent the occurrence of the disease later in the fall or next year. So with all of that, I will turn this back to Dr. Shilsky.
Actually, Dr. Lyman, let's skip first.
I'm sorry.
No worry at all. Thank you very much. So thank you very much. That was excellent. And while the worst of the immediate COVID-19 crisis might soon be behind us, the impact of the pandemic will clearly be with us for a long while. Now is the time to plan collectively for a smooth transition to post-crisis cancer care. So to do that, bold policy actions at the federal level will be essential. Today, ASCO is issuing a policy agenda for Congress and the administration. The agenda focuses on 8 policy changes needed to sustain high-quality cancer care through the remainder of the crisis while planning for the future. For example, the administration should enhance and make permanent Medicare support for telehealth, which can help patients access care. To give you a sense of just how much the oncology community has shifted in this direction, data from ASCO's CancerLink database shows a major increase in telehealth visits since the outbreak began. While there were just a handful of telehealth visits in February, there are now been thousands in the month of March. This data will be made available on ASCO's website. Congress should help sustain the access to care by ensuring that struggling physician practices receive necessary financial relief beyond the much-needed funds granted recently through the CARES Act. Congress should finally require that oral cancer treatments be reimbursed at levels comparable to intravenous chemotherapy, since oral medicines can be taken at home without the risk of COVID-19 exposure. And as I previewed earlier, we need aggressive action to mitigate drug shortages. The goal should be constant awareness of availability through the supply chain, together with development of contingency plans before shortages occur. ASCO will stay closely engaged with policymakers to advocate for our patients and our professional community in the months ahead. Next slide. Looking further ahead, ASCO views this crisis as an opportunity to improve the quality and resiliency of cancer care well into the future. It's possible that solutions crafted in a crisis will lead to novel ways of delivering care and conducting research. One key step we're taking is the creation of 2 multidisciplinary volunteer work groups. They'll consist of ASCO member volunteers from every part of the cancer care team, as well as patients. They will focus respectively on cancer care delivery and cancer research. As soon as this fall, they will deliver recommendations to strengthen the system in both areas, drawing on adaptations made during the crisis. And speaking of volunteers, I'd like to close by acknowledging this is National Volunteer Week. The cancer community, like any community, depends hugely on the passion and enthusiasm of volunteers at all levels. We thank them for their service now and in the months ahead. Next slide. In fact, ASCO couldn't exist without the support of our volunteers, who have been working hard to shift gears during this time and put together a stellar scientific program of the latest research advances in cancer. The ASCO 20 virtual scientific program will be held Friday, May 29th through Sunday, May 30th. Abstracts will be released on Monday, May 13th and Thursday, May 28th. And virtual embargoed press briefings on noteworthy studies will be held for news media on the week of May 25th. Please watch for more details from ASCO's media team about how to participate. With that, we thank you for joining us today and welcome any questions you may have.
As a reminder, to submit your question, please use the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your screen. Please type your questions into the text field and hit send, and please keep the drop-down as all panelists. Additionally, please remember to direct your question to one of our panelists. All right, it looks like we have our first question. This question isn't directed to a specific panelist. The question is, are there guidelines or advice to help cancer patients know when to continue to pursue care and when they can safely postpone care?
This is Dr. Burris. I'll go ahead and take a quick answer, and maybe Dr. Shulsky or Dr. Dillman or Dr. Lyman would like to comment as well. But we have on the ASCO website, cancer.net, some excellent resources for the patients. It certainly will depend on the disease, whether the patient is experiencing breast or colon or lung cancer, and the type of therapy that they're receiving, be that one of the new immunotherapies or be that one of the chemotherapy. So there's a number of variables there. But the ASCO.org website is fabulous for the physicians, and cancer.net has got great resources on there for questions specific to issues that are arising during the COVID-19 pandemic.
All right, and our next question is, does ASCO have information on the number of cancer clinical trials delayed or suspended because of COVID-19? Dr.
Shulsky, do you want to take that question?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a crack at that. So we don't have a specific number of clinical trials that we know have been delayed or suspended. We know that the National Cancer Institute, which has been monitoring enrollment of patients on the clinical trials that it sponsors in its National Clinical Trials Network, has already observed about a 40% decline in patient enrollments on NCI-sponsored trials. So there's no doubt that clinical trials are being put on hold. Patients are reluctant to access clinical trials at this time because it often requires more visits to the healthcare system. And of course, many physician practices and hospitals that have been dedicated to offering clinical trials to patients have chosen to delay or suspend enrollment, in part because they have to redirect staff away from supporting research programs to supporting critically ill patients with COVID-19 and cancer. So it's going to take a while for all this to recover, but we certainly are optimistic that clinical trials will remain a key element of the care of cancer patients going forward.
Rich, I might just add to that from a cooperative group experience, which you know very well. We've been looking at this very carefully through the National Cancer Institute funded SWOG Cancer Research Network. I think the same things apply to the other cooperative groups running many of the major clinical trials, and have seen, of course, a considerable downturn in accrual over the last month to 6 weeks. Interestingly enough, it hasn't gone to zero. It's gone down probably 50% or a little more than 50%, but some trials are continuing, and we're deep in discussions, and again, other groups as well, on what trials we can safely reopen early and what ones we may have to wait a while before opening up. We haven't officially closed any trials, but the accrual definitely has gone down. I will only add that the National Cancer Institute has loosened somewhat of their restrictions on allowing patients to be treated at other practices or other institutions, whereas they might have previously required them to come back to the Comprehensive Cancer Center for their treatment, which can be problematic in this era, and allowing qualified oncologists to treat the patient on the trial or continue on the trial closer to their home and maybe under safer conditions.
All right, and our next question is for Dr. Burris and Dr. Lyman. I'm curious about the differences between the CCC-19 and the ASCO registries. Do we really need both?
Yeah, this is Skip Burris. I'll go ahead and start with that first. I mean, certainly There are many things that we need to learn about COVID-19 and cancer care in the immediate and term and over time. And while each of these efforts deserves a distinct purpose, we think a major strength of CC19 was the speed and simplicity, while ASCO's registry is going to be especially valuable because of its longitudinal data. If recent weeks are any indication, we're confident that the organizations leading these efforts will continue to collaborate, share information, and combine our learning to benefit patients. I think the longitudinal aspect and the data we gather over the next few months from these varied practices across the U.S. will really give us a much better perspective as to the overall impact on cancer care.
I'll just add to your comments, Kip, Dr. Burris, that I consider, as probably everyone on the call considers ASCO our professional home, and very active with ASCO. When this began to hit our community and our practices, we frantically began talking to colleagues, a lot of it on social media. In fact, we published a paper this week in Nature Cancer, kind of summarizing what happened with that social engagement and how it led to the early work on CCC19, which was launched within days of when all of us decided we needed to do something to learn more about the impact of COVID-19, specifically on cancer patients. So we, again, reached out. I frankly think these are complementary efforts. ASCO, of course, brings to the registry or to the tracking of COVID-19 cancer patients a well-oiled professional organization, professional gravitas, wide engagement, credibility, and so forth. And not to disparage my colleagues with CCC19, because we're very passionate and engaged in this process, and we've accrued hundreds and hundreds of patients from over 90 institutions throughout the country. But there are, we have shared a lot of what our data elements are. I think there are parallels. We're still in discussions. How can we, make sure our efforts will link up as much as possible to even speed up more rapidly the learning process here, and then eventually the impact of management of these patients and even treatments that are coming down the pike more rapidly. There are other professional organizations in the U.S. and globally as well doing the same thing. I think this is, this is a time when we need all hands on deck, everybody doing the best, and then we need to look back and talk to one another and engage with one another as best we can to make sure we're not duplicating efforts. And I think that's really being done at the present time.
All right, and our next question is, are there shortages of PPD in the oncology community? Are there sufficient supplies for the winter with second wave of SARS-CoV-2 and the flu?
Dr. Shulsky, do you want to take that?
Sure. Well, I would say that the oncology community is no different from the rest of the medical community and has almost certainly experienced lack of adequate PPE for the workforce. The hope is that is being remedied every day with greater production and greater delivery of all the necessary supplies and equipment. I think we can anticipate that there will be an ongoing and perhaps a increasing need if there's a second wave of COVID-19 that comes in the fall. But hopefully the country will be much better prepared at that time for what the needs of the medical community are. So I don't have much more I can say about that, but obviously this is not unique to cancer care providers, but it is important to us. We are hopeful that all the needs will be met as production gets stepped up here and around the globe.
All right, and our next question is, How much additional relief from the federal budget sequester is ASCO seeking?
Rich, do you want to take that question?
I don't know that I have that a specific answer to that at my fingertips, except to say that in essence, what we're seeking is for relief from the sequester to return to pre-sequester levels. So, as I think many people on the phone realize, for physicians who buy and then deliver chemotherapy drugs to patients, their reimbursement level has typically been at a level where they get reimbursed according to the average sales price for the drug plus a margin. The margin has been significantly reduced under sequester, and that obviously limits the capacity of oncologists to provide lots of services to patients that are actually not otherwise reimbursed. At this point in particular, we want the sequester to at least be temporarily removed, but frankly, in the long term, it would be best for cancer care delivery if the sequester was permanently removed, and that's our long-term goal.
This is Dr. Burris. Dr. Dillman, anything you'd like to add there?
I agree with what Dr. Shulsky said. The sequester is in that percent on top of the cost of the drug is what we use to pay pharmacists, nurses, social workers, nutritionists, all the non-reimbursed services that we provide that make the cancer care team effective and make delivery of care seamless. And so removing that 2% sequester will be helpful for physicians who are struggling, like I said earlier, with significant impacts to their clinic and to their hospitals.
All right, I'm not seeing any further questions, so now I'll turn it over to Dr. Burris to close us out.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to our panel, and thank you to those who took a few minutes to listen today and hear this Presscast. Thank you very much for attending. For media interview requests or additional questions on the impact of COVID-19 on cancer care, please email mediateam@asco.org. And with that, we'll end today's program. Have a great rest of your day.